The kingdom of Lisserol was carved from pale marble and crowned with mirrors. Every wall shimmered, every window gleamed, and even the cobblestones reflected light as though ashamed of any shadow. Beauty was not just adored, it was law. Poise mattered more than honesty, and a flawless face held more weight than a thoughtful word. People practiced their smiles and polished silver each morning, refining them until they were symmetrical and serene. Those who faltered, those with crooked teeth or voices that stammered, learned early to keep their heads bowed and eyes low. Marin had been bowing her head since she was old enough to walk. She had the sort of face that people forgot while still looking at it. Quiet brown eyes, skin the color of candle wax, a slender frame more bone than curve. She wore plain clothes patched over too many winters, and her dark hair was always pulled back tight, hidden beneath a soot-gray kerchief. The only color on her was ash on her elbows, her cheeks, her apron. She was the girl who lived at the edge of the house, who stepped softly, who spoke rarely. Her hands were always busy, and her presence, as far as others were concerned, was the same as furniture. Useful, silent, invisible. Her stepmother, Lady Talia, had once been a court beauty, though age had begun to chip away at the lacquer of her perfection. She painted her face every morning with the care of a sculptor restoring a cracked statue. But no paint could hide the coldness in her eyes or the permanent curve of disdain on her lips. And her daughter, Silly, bore her mother's looks and doubled her cruelty. Silly moved like a dancer and spoke like a queen, but her words were barbed hooks. Every compliment carried a wound. Marin was their shadow. She was the one who cleaned their mirrored halls, who folded Silly's gowns of silk and stitched pearls back into the hems when they snagged. She scrubbed the hearth 3 times a day, as though it were a window to be polished, not a place for warmth. And though her fingers bled and her back ached, she never complained. Complaints were unwelcome in Lisserol, especially from those with ash on their skin. "You missed a corner," Silly would say, pointing with a toe as she perched on a velvet chaise, her nails painted gold. "What good is a girl who can't clean what she is?" Marin never replied. Not because she lacked the words, but because the words would only make things worse. Silence was a shield. And she had learned early that truth in this kingdom was never welcome when it came from someone with a dirty face. But the fire listened. At night, after the rest of the house had gone still, Marin would sit beside the hearth with a worn blanket pulled over her shoulders and let her thoughts drift. The flames would crackle softly, not roaring, not demanding, just there. Her fingers would brush the edge of the brick, tracing lines worn smooth by years of scrubbing. The warmth soothed her, bone deep, as if it recognized something in her that no one else could see. And sometimes, only sometimes, she would hear things. Not voices exactly. More like whispers in the flicker of light, shapes that danced within the flame that looked almost like people, like memories. They didn't scare her. If anything, they calmed her. They made her feel less alone. As if the fire remembered something that the world had chosen to forget. The stories helped too. The house had a tiny attic room that no one but Marin used. It was dusty and cramped and far too cold in the winter, but it had one thing none of the other rooms did: a forgotten shelf of old books. Most were too moldy to read, but a few still held together. She would sneak them down in secret and read by the hearth late at night, the words dancing in her head like lullabies. Her favorite was a tattered volume of legends, stories of women with silver wings and men who turned into trees. In one tale, a girl climbed into a fire and came out made of light. Marin read that story more times than she could count. Fairy trash, Lady Talia had once called the book when she caught Marin with it. She snatched it away, tore several pages out, and threw them into the hearth. But even as the paper curled and blackened, the flames didn't rage. They pulsed once, deeply, as if swallowing something they recognized. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Marin pulled the book's remnants from the ashes. The edges were singed, but the story was still there. She read it again and again, mouthing the words like spells. Sometimes, in the quiet, she felt as though the fire was waiting for her to ask something. But she didn't know what to say. What could she ask that wouldn't sound like a plea? She kept moving. Kept cleaning, cooking, mending. She kept her eyes down, her voice in, her head full of smoke and song. She never imagined anything would change. The kingdom didn't change. Girls like her were born to serve, and the only escape was through silence or death. Then came the day of the mirror census. Every 5 years, officials traveled door to door, inspecting households and rating the occupants for visual worthiness. It was an old tradition, passed down from the days when beauty was believed to be a divine virtue. A high rating meant better social standing, more invitations, more chances to climb the ladder of esteem. A low rating meant nothing changed. Or worse. Lady Talia prepared the house for days, polishing every surface until it gleamed, arranging Silly's wardrobe in color-coded tiers, practicing compliments and curtsies in the parlor mirror. Marin was told to stay out of sight, or you'll bring down the average. She obeyed. She always did. She spent the morning in the cellar, sorting vegetables, her hands raw from peeling. When the inspectors finally arrived, Marin heard them from below, the click of boots, the hum of flattery, Silly's laughter like bells dipped in venom. She knew better than to interrupt. But the fire knew better. As the officials walked through the halls, one of them paused before the hearth. Odd. That brickwork, he said, it's older than the rest. Look, see how it's darker, warmer? As if it's hiding something. Lady Talia laughed too quickly. Just age, my lord. We have nothing to hide. He leaned in, running a hand over the brick. Feels different. Odder. Alive. I assure you, she snapped, it's just a hearth. But the man lingered, staring at the flame. For a moment, Marin swore she saw him shiver. That night, she returned to the hearth as always. She pressed her palm against the brick the man had touched. It throbbed faintly beneath her skin. The fire fluttered higher. Just once. She whispered, "What are you trying to tell me?" There was no answer. Only warmth. Only silence. Still, something shifted. The next morning, Silly spilled hot tea on Marin's arm. Deliberately. Marin didn't flinch. You didn't even scream, Silly said, frowning. Are you that numb? Or are you hiding something under that ash? Marin turned her face slowly. Her eyes locked with Silly's. For once, she didn't look away. I burn different, she said. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a boast. It was just truth. Silly backed away, startled. Marin went back to scrubbing the floor. But inside her chest, something glowed, small, steady, undeniable. Like a coal waiting for air. The kingdom of mirrors had rules. But the hearth had memory. And the girl who lived among its ashes was not as small as they believed. She would wait. She would listen. The fire wasn't finished with her yet. Marin knelt by the hearth as she had 100 times before, a soot-smeared shadow in a kitchen that gleamed everywhere but where she lived. The stone floor was cold beneath her knees, and the ash clung to her fingertips like second skin. The iron poker trembled slightly in her grasp as she stirred the half-dying embers, bringing back their reluctant glow. She knew this fire, its patterns, its moods, the way it liked to catch light from the dry pine and resist damp wood. But tonight it was watching her. The whisper came soft, barely louder than the crackle of the logs. Marin. She froze, but not out of fear. Her heart thudded with a strange recognition. No one called her by name like that, not with softness, not with warmth. It was the kind of voice she thought she had forgotten, like a lullaby once sung and then lost to time. She looked around, but the kitchen was empty. Her stepmother and Silly were upstairs, preparing for some noblewoman's dinner. The servants avoided her, and the house, though grand, kept her tucked away like a ghost. Marin, the voice repeated. The flames curled, almost bowing toward her. She reached toward them without thinking. Her fingers closed around a glowing coal, not out of madness but something deeper. She felt no pain. No blister. The coal rested in her palm like a warm stone from the sun, pulsing gently. She stared at it, stunned. When she finally dropped it back into the fire, it hissed in protest as though it had not wanted to leave her hand. She waited for the pain, for red welts or blackened skin. But her palm remained pale, untouched. Ash brushed off her skin as if it feared her now. The next morning she woke before dawn, unsure if it had been real. The memory clung to her, though, and so did a new presence. The flames now leaned toward her when she passed. When she tossed wood in, it caught almost instantly. When she knelt by the hearth, it warmed the air like an embrace. She didn't tell anyone. Silly wouldn't understand. She would twist it into something cruel. Her stepmother would accuse her of witchery or worse, and in this kingdom even whispers of such things carried heavy cost. But Marin couldn't stay away from the fire. Night after night, when the house was asleep, she returned. Sometimes she simply watched the fire, listening to the cracks and murmurs that only she seemed to hear. Sometimes she spoke back, quietly, asking it questions she never dared ask anyone else. "Why me?" she whispered one night. The flame danced. Not an answer. Not really. But a kind of acknowledgement. Another night, "What am I?" And the fire flared for a heartbeat, golden bright, before returning to its usual rhythm. One evening she took a candle and placed her finger in the flame. No pain. The wick bent toward her as if it knew her. She dipped both hands into the hearth coals and lifted 2 glowing pieces in her palms. They burned red, but not her. She smiled, for the first time in a long while. The fire began to speak more clearly. It didn't use words. Not really. But it gave her images, of hands shaping flame like clay, of a girl crowned not in gold, but in embers that curled through her hair like ribbons. Of ancient symbols carved into hearthstones, of a time when fire was more than warmth, when it chose people, not the other way around. And each time she listened, something inside her awakened, a warmth that wasn't physical but deep. Something she'd always carried and had never known. But her control was not perfect. One day, Silly burst into the kitchen and caught Marin kneeling in front of the fire, her hands spread in front of it like a queen giving audience. "What are you doing?" Silly snapped, eyes narrowing. "Warming my hands," Marin said calmly, hiding her slight tremble. Silly's gaze dropped to Marin's wrists, where a faint orange glow pulsed beneath the skin. Like veins of light. She paled. "You've been in the sun too long." Marin said nothing. After Silly left, she checked her reflection in the brass pot. The faint glow was fading. But she knew Silly had seen something. The question was whether she'd understand it, or be threatened by it. That night, Marin built the fire higher than usual. As the flames licked the air, she whispered, "She saw." "What do I do?" The flames rippled. For the first time she saw something within them, a pair of eyes, not hers, not human. The fire was not just listening. It was watching. "Do not be afraid," it seemed to say. But something in its heat warned her. Fear would come soon enough. A few nights later she dared to test her bond again. She placed a silver spoon in the fire until it glowed white-hot, then picked it up by the bowl. No pain. The metal cooled in her palm as if soothed by her touch. She wasn't just resistant to fire. She belonged to it. And it belonged to her. The stories she used to whisper to herself by the fire began to feel like echoes, not of fantasy but of memory. There were tales of flamekeepers and women who danced barefoot on coals, unburnt. Tales of fire spirits who chose companions once every generation. Of how fire was the oldest language, the first whisperer of truth, the first protector against darkness. She wondered if her mother, the one she could barely remember, had known these tales. Had maybe told them to her once, long ago, before the silence, before the ashes. Sometimes she imagined a hand reaching for hers from the other side of the flame. Small. Gentle. The voice in the fire felt like that of someone who had always been with her. Who had been waiting. One night the voice was louder. "You are close." Close to what? She didn't know. But the fire was no longer content to merely be watched. It wanted her to step in fully. The next night she waited until the house was asleep. She lit every candle, every torch, every lamp in the kitchen. The room glowed like a temple. She sat cross-legged before the hearth and whispered, "Show me." And the fire leapt. It surged high but not wild. It curved like a doorway. Shapes moved inside it, dancers of flame, symbols older than language. Her skin drank in the heat. She reached forward. The moment her fingers passed the threshold of the flame, a pulse ran through her, not heat but memory. She saw a girl, herself, younger, laughing by a fire in a cottage surrounded by forest. She saw a woman, her mother, turning toward her with bright eyes and firelight tangled in her hair. Then a scream. A tower. Chains. Flames dimmed. The voice faded. Marin pulled back, breathless. She had remembered something. Not everything but a beginning. The fire whispered one final thing before dying down to gentle orange coals. "Soon you will walk through the fire. And they will see what they tried to burn away." Marin shivered, not in fear but anticipation. The next morning her palms still glowed faintly. When she passed near flames, candles flared. Fire wanted her to know. It had chosen her. And soon so would the world. The royal proclamation arrived at noon, carried by a courier dressed in scarlet livery and gold-threaded boots. He did not step down from his horse for common folk, not even for the steward of their house, but read aloud from a scroll with the kind of voice that made everyone stop to listen. "By order of His Highness Prince Elric of House Vermiel," the man intoned, "a series of trials shall be held to seek a queen not by beauty alone, but by strength of heart, clarity of mind, resilience of spirit, and grace in challenge." Gasps spread through the gathered villagers like ripples in a pond. "This shall be no masquerade ball," the man continued, "but a week of proving held within the royal gardens and halls. All eligible maidens of noble blood are invited to present themselves." By the time he finished, Silly had already turned to their mother with feverish eyes. "I'll win," she whispered. "I'll win and I'll wear the crown." Their mother's smile was slow and tight, like a trap snapping shut. "Of course you will. You were born for it." That very night they began preparations. The house buzzed with tailors and voice tutors, with posture coaches and herbalists who brewed potions to lighten the eyes and flush the cheeks. Marin was made to fetch, carry, scrub and press. She was a shadow in the background of Silly's parade. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Silly would be queen, or she would make life unlivable for anyone who stood in her way. As for Marin, she was not even considered. You? Silly scoffed one morning, catching Marin watching from the kitchen door. You think the prince wants a girl with soot on her face and cinders in her hair? Stay where you belong. Their mother added, You won't go near the castle. We have worked too hard for this family's elevation to let a dirty thing like you embarrass us. Marin lowered her gaze but said nothing. They had always believed her silence meant submission. It didn't. That night she returned to the hearth, heart heavy. The fire was low, almost out, but its embers pulsed like the last beats of a sleeping heart. She knelt before it as always and whispered into the smoke. I don't care about the crown. But something in me knows. I'm meant to go. The flames stirred. Then came the voice, clearer than ever. There will be no crown without ashes. Marin closed her eyes. The room disappeared, and in the firelight she saw visions again. Not of castles or jewels, but of trials. A girl walking across coals. A hand reaching into boiling water to save another. A voice raised against a lie. The crown was not gold, it was fire itself. The next day Silly's shrieking echoed through the halls. The trial begins with a vigil, she spat, hurling a silver comb at the mirror. We have to sit outside the palace gate for one night, without servants, without protection. It's barbaric. Their mother hushed her, reminding her that appearances must be preserved. The weak will be weeded out, she said. That's what this is. You must shine from the very first breath. The next 3 days were a storm. Silly practiced curtsies and studied court poetry. She soaked in rosewater and starflower milk. She rehearsed tears of sympathy and modest smiles. Her mother plotted alliances with barons and bridesmaids alike. And Marin was made to work harder than ever. Each night, her fingers blistered from scrubbing. Each morning, her back ached from carrying baskets to market. But each night, she returned to the fire, and each night, the flame burned brighter, more knowing. The night before the vigil, Silly lay beneath a velvet canopy, her face covered in pearl dust, a jade roller gliding across her cheeks. Tomorrow I begin my rise, she said. And you, little ash girl, will finally be where you belong, forgotten. But that night, when all was quiet and the moon hung low, Marin knelt before the fire and whispered, Guide me. The fire answered in warmth, not words. She rose. Her dress was tattered, her face unpainted, her shoes worn. But her eyes held a light no court tutor could teach. She opened the kitchen door, stepped into the cold and walked toward the castle. No invitation. No carriage. No title. Just fire in her veins, and the memory of what the flame had shown her, that true worth is not draped in silk. It is found in trials, and survived in silence. She reached the gate of the palace just before dawn. The guards tried to turn her away. Servants are not permitted. But she stood, unflinching. I have come to take the trial, she said. They laughed. But when the sun rose and the first test began, she was still there, her hands warm, her eyes bright, her silence louder than any cry for attention. She did not yet know what the test would bring. But the fire had whispered a promise, and fire never lies. The morning of the prince's first event dawned with a rare clarity, the sun a molten disk that bled gold over the village rooftops and distant hills. Marin had been up for hours, tending the kitchen fires and sweeping the long stone corridors of the house. Her steps were quiet, her motions automatic, yet inside her chest her heart beat with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, something like hope. It trembled quietly like a bird just learning it still had wings. Hidden deep beneath the loose floorboard in the attic, she had stashed a simple dress, pale, flowing, and sewn by her own hands over many moons, from scraps too small to be missed and thread pulled loose from older garments. It had taken her months of secret work. Every stitch was an act of quiet defiance, every hem a whisper of longing. She didn't know if she truly believed she'd wear it. But the fire had spoken again last night, its voice low and warm like an old friend. There will be no crown without ashes. Downstairs, Silly stood in front of the mirror, draped in embroidered silk, her hair coiled high and stiff with oils and pins. The stepmother buzzed around her, adjusting earrings, dabbing perfume at her throat, fretting over every imagined flaw. They had spent weeks preparing Silly for this series of trials, though no one knew what exactly the prince's tests of virtue would be. Rumors ranged from storytelling to surviving in the woods for a night. But all agreed, beauty would still be the key. Marin remained invisible to them. That morning, Silly hadn't even looked her way as she ordered her to clean the lower hearth, tracking soot and ash on the hem of her blue gown. It was only when Marin returned later, quiet, her hands no longer blackened, her expression unreadable, that Silly's eyes narrowed. "You're hiding something," she snapped. "Where were you?" Marin looked down. "Nowhere." Silly stepped forward and slapped the pail from Marin's hands. It clattered to the floor, spilling gray ash in a cloud. "Don't lie. I saw you near the attic. What are you doing up there, you rat?" Marin said nothing. That silence, the same silence Marin had used as armor for years, suddenly became a spark in Silly's dry, jealous heart. She turned, stormed up the stairs and tore through the attic with shrieks of anger. Marin followed, helpless, too slow to stop her. Within moments, Silly had yanked the hidden bundle of fabric from beneath the floorboards, holding it up like a kill. "This?" she hissed. "You thought you'd go? You thought you'd dare stand next to me? You, the hearth maid." The stepmother appeared in the doorway then, frowning. Her eyes flicked between the girls, from the dress to Marin's face. Something uncertain flickered in her expression. Perhaps, just for a moment, she wondered if Marin had always been more than she let herself see. But Silly saw none of it. Her fury, like dry wood catching, grew into flame. "You think you're special," she snarled, descending the stairs with the dress clutched in her fist. "You think being quiet makes you clever? That your little stares and stories make you noble?" "I never said that," Marin whispered. Silly turned sharply, eyes burning. "You don't have to. You act like it. Like we're the ones beneath you. But you're nothing." Marin's feet were heavy as she followed them into the main hall, where the hearth blazed with a roaring morning fire. The flames crackled against the stones, eating at fresh logs like they were starving. "Maybe it's time," Silly said slowly. "You remembered your place." She stepped up to the fire. The dress dangled above it. "No," Marin said softly. "Please?" But Silly's hand didn't move. Instead, she turned on her. And shoved. It happened so quickly, a blur of silk, a scream that never reached the air, the rush of heat and the scent of smoke. The stepmother gasped, too late to stop it. Marin tumbled backward, toward the flames, toward the crackling orange mouth of the hearth that had always both punished and protected her. But there was no scream. The fire rose in a wall of light, licking the ceiling, throwing orange shadows across the room. Then silence. Total silence. Silly staggered back, mouth open as if waiting for the sound of a body hitting coals. The stepmother covered her mouth. "What have you done?" But the fire didn't burn. It pulsed. Then it dimmed. And from the heart of it, a figure stepped forward. Marin walked out of the hearth. Not a scorch mark on her skin. Not a singed thread on her dress, which now glowed faintly gold at the edges, the threads transformed as if woven by heat and smoke itself. Her hair drifted behind her like ash in a slow wind. Her eyes shone, not with fear but with something deeper. Something ancient. Silly screamed. The stepmother backed away, trembling, making a holy sign with her fingers. Marin looked down at her palms. Her skin was clean. Unburned. In her hand sat a coal, still warm, flickering with light, and it did not hurt her. It hummed like a living thing. "You," Silly gasped. "You're cursed." Marin tilted her head. "No. I'm chosen." The hearth behind her went still. Cold. The fire had vanished. Only embers remained like sleeping stars. Marin stepped forward, and neither of them could stop her. She picked up her dress from where Silly had dropped it. The fabric shimmered strangely now, no longer pale linen but something richer, darker, threaded with firelight. "You shouldn't have done that," Marin said softly. Not angry. Just sure. The room remained silent, save for the faint crack of settling stone in the hearth. Marin turned. And walked away. Not to hide. Not to weep. But to become something neither Silly nor her mother could understand. The fire had spoken. And it had chosen her. No one in the house said it aloud, not at first. But servants whispered, eyes wide, when they passed each other in the halls. One maid claimed she'd seen Marin walk barefoot across the hot ash without flinching. Another swore she spoke to the fire and it flickered in response. And though most denied it in public, the whispers ran like a hidden current beneath the household's routine. Marin stepped into the flames, and walked out unburned. Silly screamed witchcraft the next morning. "She's cursed," she shrieked, raking her hands through her hair. "She should be in chains. She should be dragged to the castle and examined by the royal flamekeepers." Her mother, pale and tight-lipped, sipped her tea as though nothing had happened at all. "You had a fainting spell," she said calmly. That girl wasn't in the fire. You imagined it. We all did. I saw her, Silly insisted, trembling. I felt the heat. I pushed her and she vanished, and then, her voice broke off. The stepmother's spoon clicked gently against porcelain. You are exhausted. You need sleep. Too much worry over your performance for the prince. The silence that followed was not agreement. It was calculation. Because the stepmother had seen it too. She had watched Marin walk through the fire without a mark on her skin. She had witnessed the transformation. The girl who once swept the corners now moved through rooms like smoke, silent, calm, and impossible to pin down. But to speak it aloud meant accepting something larger than ambition, larger than power. It meant surrendering control. So she chose silence instead. Marin, for her part, said nothing to them. She simply went about her duties, but not as before. She no longer hunched or scurried. She no longer avoided eye contact or waited to be dismissed. When spoken to, she replied in a voice low and measured, like wind passing through a narrow canyon. Her eyes, once downcast, now met others' stares, steady, unblinking. And she smiled. Not cruelly. Not often. But when she did, it felt less like joy and more like understanding. At night, when the house slept, she returned to the hearth. She would kneel there in silence and press her fingers to the embers. The heat coiled up around her skin but never harmed it. Slowly, she would walk barefoot across the coals, one step at a time, pausing as if listening to something far away. The fire never roared for her. It hummed. It bent toward her. It welcomed her like a forgotten daughter. Sometimes she spoke to it. Not in spells or incantations, but in soft questions and confessions. Why now? She would whisper. Why me? She didn't always get answers. But she felt watched. Not with menace but with recognition. The fire knew her. It had always known her. Silly, sleepless and twitching with fury, began watching her through cracks in the door. The more she saw, the more unhinged she became. She paced her room at night, muttering to herself, trying to light candles that refused to stay lit. She avoided the hearths entirely, convinced they were watching her. Once, she tried to command a servant to throw salt into the fire. The flames flared and died instantly, the logs hissing like snakes. The household grew tense. Rooms went colder. Servants avoided the main hall. No one wanted to speak near the fire. It had taken a side. They all knew it. Even the cat, once Silly's shadow, had taken to curling beside Marin's feet, blinking slowly at her as if in worship. Flowers in the garden bent toward her steps when she passed. The mirrors in the hallway, once dull, seemed to shimmer faintly when she walked by. In the kitchen, where once she had been ordered about, she now moved freely, and others stepped aside without thinking. When she asked for something, it was given. Not out of fear but out of instinct. As though something older than memory had declared a shift in the wind. The house was no longer divided by blood or name. It was divided by flame. And it had chosen. The second event of the royal competition took place in the grand courtyard of the palace, where stone columns rose like watchful giants and torches flickered along the marble walls. Nobles in gold-threaded silks perched on cushioned benches, whispering behind painted fans and jeweled hands. The prince sat at the highest dais, eyes shadowed beneath the ceremonial diadem of selection. His posture was upright, formal, but his gaze drifted often. Not to the competitors but to the sky, the torches, the spaces between. He was quite clearly bored. The contest of the day was titled, The Test of Resolve, designed by the Royal Council to reveal poise, balance, and inner strength. A tightrope had been suspended over a shallow trench filled with flame, not high enough to kill but searing enough to scar if someone fell. The rope swayed slightly in the breeze, its ends anchored by the carved hands of two marble statues of warrior queens. One by one the candidates stepped up. They were noble girls in stiff gowns, trained since childhood to appear unshakable. Some made it halfway, teetering with white-knuckled grace. Others froze and had to be helped down. A few crossed the rope, arms trembling, faces pale, eyes flicking down with terror. The crowd clapped politely. The prince offered nods and faint smiles. But there was no fire in the moment. Only the fire below. Until the last bell rang. A hush spread as the great gates creaked open, and a lone figure stepped into the courtyard. She wore no silk, no gold, no jewels. Just a hooded cloak the color of soot, tied at the throat with a simple twist of red thread. She moved with quiet purpose, each footfall as soft as falling ash. Her face was hidden, but the air shifted as she passed. Heat seemed to rise in her wake. Guards stepped forward, unsure, No one had announced a final contestant. The prince raised a hand. Let her try. There was silence, and then a murmur that rippled through the court like wind stirring dry leaves. Silly, seated with her mother among the honored guests, leaned forward in disbelief. No, she whispered. No, it can't be. But it was. Marin stepped forward, hood still drawn. She faced the rope and without hesitation kicked off her sandals. The fire beneath crackled eagerly, sparks dancing up toward her bare feet. She did not look down. She did not tremble. She stepped onto the rope. A gasp echoed through the courtyard. The rope swayed slightly, but Marin moved as though the world beneath her had vanished. The fire did not threaten her. It rose with her. It cradled the space below her feet, warming the air around her like an embrace. Her balance was not just steady, it was fluid, purposeful. Every movement of her body whispered certainty. Halfway across she paused, and lowered her hood. The crowd murmured louder now, some rising to their feet. Ash-dark hair caught the torchlight. Her face was calm, strong, eyes lit not with fear, but with something deeper, something timeless. She looked directly at the prince. He stared back. There was recognition in his eyes, not of a face but of a feeling. A memory. A flicker of warmth that had long been buried. Something ancient stirred in his chest, like the spark of a song once lost in childhood. Marin continued walking. She reached the far end of the rope, stepped off, bowed, then stood waiting. Not humble, not pleading, just present. The court erupted in confused applause. Some nobles clapped too hard, unsure what else to do. Others whispered accusations beneath their breath. Who is she? She's not noble. That wasn't allowed. She cheated. She bewitched the rope. But the prince said nothing. He simply rose to his feet and descended from the dais. He approached her in full view of the court, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. You came through fire, he said softly, and didn't burn. Marin met his gaze evenly. Because it knows me. The prince smiled, the first true smile of the day. The torch flames around them flared high and golden. Marin sat before the hearth that night, her bare feet pressed against the cool stone floor, her palms resting on her knees. The fire burned low, not with the fury of cooking heat but with a gentler, pulsing rhythm, as if waiting. Shadows danced on the walls of the small cottage, and outside the wind moaned low through the village trees. She had returned from the palace in silence, ignoring the seething stares of Silly and the stepmother's stiff silence. They couldn't reach her anymore. They had seen her walk above the flames. Now only one place could give her what she needed. Tell me, she whispered. The fire blinked in response, then rose. The flames twisted higher, but the heat did not drive her back. They moved like ribbon dancers, forming shapes she did not fully understand, not at first. Then the flames shifted, coloring to deep gold, and within them she saw a woman. Not formed from smoke or dream, but whole, her eyes glowing with the same molten hue that Marin had seen in her own reflection after the fireplace incident. The woman's hair was coiled like flame itself, her robes woven of flickering embers and velvet darkness. She stood tall, proud, arms stretched toward a sky speckled with stars. And she was singing, not words but fire-made sound. A melody too old for language but filled with meaning all the same. Marin felt the vibration in her chest. The vision blurred and new images poured through the fire. A cradle surrounded by glowing coals. A mother lifting a child to her chest while people with fearful eyes pounded at the door. A flash of silver blades, cloaks bearing the royal seal, the same seal that now adorned the prince's tunic. Marin's breath caught. Another flash, the woman running through trees, the child bundled in soot-dark cloth, cradled close. A final act of magic, the mother placing the child beside an old hearth in a cottage at the village's edge. The child's cheek was marked with soot. The fire whispered one word. Sanctuary. Then the vision fell away. Marin blinked. The flames had returned to their normal rhythm, crackling soft and low. She sat still, the images echoing behind her eyes, her heart thudding not with fear, but recognition. Her mother had not died in shame or failure. She had died protecting her, not from fire but from those who feared its truth. The magic was ancient, yes, and feared, but it had once been honored. Flame-bearers they were called. Women, sometimes men, who could read memory through flame, shape truth through heat, bend warmth into protection or clarity. They had been guardians, guides, keepers of stories too dangerous to write down. The kingdom had once relied on them, until fear twisted trust into betrayal. They were not witches. They were memory itself. And she, Marin, was born from their line. She had never belonged in the shadows of cinder. The ashes had not been a punishment forced on her by her stepmother. They had been the last trace of magic shielding her, hiding her, holding her safe until she was ready to remember. Her fingers closed gently over a coal from the hearth. It glowed warmly in her palm, flickering but never burning. She smiled, small but real. The fire whispered once more, like a lullaby from some forgotten flame-born cradle. You are not what they feared. You are what they tried to forget. And Marin, barefoot, soot-cloaked, heart alight with truth, finally understood why the fire had never harmed her. It had been waiting to be seen. The cottage was cold when Marin stepped through the door. The hearth, once the warm pulse of the house, once her only companion, was torn apart. Stones lay shattered, charred remains of old firewood scattered like broken bones. Ash was smeared across the floor in strange symbols, and the heavy scent of burnt sage clung to the air like rot. Her breath caught in her throat. The hearth was gone. Her connection. Her anchor. Her truth. She stepped inside slowly, the wooden floor groaning beneath her. Each step felt hollow. Silly had done this. Marin didn't need to ask how. The signature was clear. The precision of destruction, the symbols carved into the stone and scorched into the soot, this was the work of a court sorcerer. Someone trained to sever magical ties, to burn out spirit bonds with sanctioned spells. Cleanse the house, Silly must have said, smiling sweetly. There's a curse in the walls. And the court, too polite or too ambitious to question a noble daughter's word, had allowed it. Marin stood in the center of the ruin and lowered to her knees. She reached for the ashes, hoping, praying something still lived in them. But when her fingers touched the black dust, it was cold. Not dormant. Not quiet. Just gone. She bowed her head. Not in defeat, but in grief. They'll see what they've done. The final test was the next day. A trial of truth, a tradition from centuries past, revived by Prince Edric as the final event to choose not just a consort, but a partner in rule. The remaining contestants would speak before the court and answer unscripted questions, judged not for grace or charm, but for honesty and conviction. A dangerous test for anyone hiding secrets. Which was exactly what Silly counted on. The courtroom was high-domed and silver-draped, sunlight pouring in from skylights above. Nobles whispered from their cushioned seats. The royal family sat at the dais, the prince at the center. He looked tired, his expression unreadable. Silly entered in a gown of glimmering pale gold, her hair curled to perfection. Marin followed, cloaked in plain gray, her hands bare, soot still under her nails. Silly smiled as though nothing had happened. But her voice rang cold and clear as she stepped forward when her turn came. I must speak not just for myself, she began, but for the kingdom. The room hushed. She has deceived us, Silly said, pointing toward Marin. She is not a servant girl. She is not a humble contender. She is a fire witch, a creature of cursed flame. She cannot be burned because she is the fire. Gasps echoed like cannon fire. Several nobles recoiled. One lady dropped her goblet. Marin said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on Silly, unblinking. She bent the flames to enter the contest. She walked through fire and tricked us all. My mother and I tried to protect the realm. We brought a court sorcerer to cleanse the curse from our home. And we found proof, symbols in the ashes, magic hiding in our hearth. She waited for applause. But none came. The silence grew thick. Prince Edric leaned forward slowly. Is that true? He asked Marin, his voice careful. Marin stepped into the light. The last of the sun caught in her hair. She opened her hand, revealing a single coal, flickering softly, pulled from her cloak pocket. The court gasped again. But she did not deny it. Yes, she said. Her voice was low and clear. I was born of flame. Not conjured, not cursed, born. She looked to the prince, then the crowd. I was cast into fire. I walked out whole. That is not trickery. That is truth. You wanted a test of character, a trial of honesty. So I will not hide what I am. I do not serve the fire. It walks with me. A ripple moved through the room. The coal in her hand sparked brighter, not angrily, not violently, but with slow, deliberate warmth. And as it glowed, so did something in the prince's eyes. Silly opened her mouth again, but no sound came. She saw the tide shift. The court that once feared had seen something they couldn't explain, but also couldn't deny. The fire flickered once more. This time not in accusation but in answer. The square was crowded with nobles, courtiers, and commoners alike, drawn by the promise of judgment wrapped in spectacle. Whispers rippled through the assembly like wind through dry leaves. Some came hoping for justice, others for blood. The fire had already been built at the center. A towering pyre of split logs stacked high oil-soaked ropes wrapped around the base to ensure an instant blaze. Marin stood before it, still cloaked in gray, her face unreadable. Her hands were empty, no ember tucked in her palm this time. No defense, no spell. Just her. The royal herald called for silence. The air trembled with anticipation. "This is not part of the original test," Prince Edric said, his voice clear but taut. He stood just beyond the arc of the assembled crowd, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, not as a threat but as if anchoring himself. The trial was to speak truth, not walk through fire. One of the king's advisors, his face pinched with suspicion, raised his hand. "But the girl claims to be a flame. If she is what she says, let the fire speak for her. If not..." He let the words hang unfinished, their weight obvious. Marin didn't look at the prince. She looked only at the flames. "They fear me," she said quietly. "So they want me to burn." She stepped forward. Edric moved, but too late. She held up one hand, not in defiance, not in submission, but in stillness. Her gaze found his. "You asked us for truth," she said. "Let me show you mine." Without waiting for permission, she walked toward the pyre. The guards hesitated, then stepped aside. No one dared stop her. Even Silly, standing beside her mother near the viewing platform, said nothing. Her mouth was tight, her eyes wide, her fingers clenching the silk at her waist. The fire was lit. It leapt to life with a roar, licking the wood, climbing quickly into a tower of heat and light. Gasps broke from the crowd. A blast of warmth rolled outward, making people step back. The fire crackled with a strange rhythm, as if it recognized her. Marin walked straight into it. The flames parted. Not instantly. They swayed, then curled aside, bending like dancers mid-bow, creating a narrow corridor of golden heat through the heart of the inferno. She walked slowly, steadily, her face serene. The fire cast shifting shadows on her skin but didn't touch her. Her bare feet stepped lightly across the burning wood, leaving no scorch, no ash. Her cloak fluttered behind her like smoke. On the far side she emerged. Not burned. Glowing. Her skin shimmered faintly, not with sweat but with an inner light, as though some ancient ember had awakened beneath her bones. Her eyes were bright, not inhuman, not alien, just alight. Alive. No one spoke. Then came a single strangled sound. Silly. The girl who had once held court with cruel smiles, who had whispered lies and wielded fear, burst into tears. The sound was not delicate or ladylike, it was raw, broken. Her hands flew to her mouth as if she could shove the truth back in, but it was too late. Her lies were naked in the open air. The crowd turned. Some looked at her with pity. Others with fury. The queen consort looked away, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Prince Edric stepped forward, past the stunned nobles, past the line of guards. He stood beside Marin. Not in front of her. Not above her. Beside. "You walked through fire," he said, voice soft but carrying. "And it bent around you. Not because you forced it, but because it knows you." Marin nodded once. The fire behind her began to die down, the flames settling into glowing coals, now just warm light in a kingdom that had long lived under cold masks. She turned to face the crowd. She didn't raise her voice, but her words rippled like heat. "I was never what they told you I was. Not ash. Not dirt. Not danger. I was flame, waiting to be remembered. And this time no one dared to deny it." The coronation was quiet by royal standards. There were no trumpets, no parades of jewels down velvet-lined halls. The sky was heavy with clouds, as if it too waited to see what kind of queen would emerge. In the great hall, the nobles gathered in hushed reverence, not out of fear but awe. They had seen the fire make way for her. They had seen her walk through truth. Marin stood at the hearth of the palace, a vast stone structure that had once been for warmth and little else. Now it was alive again. Flames danced in its belly, tame yet bright, like watchful eyes. She wore no crown. Instead, a circlet of blackened silver rested at her brow, forged from the old hearth grates, shaped by a blacksmith who had once been orphaned and who now stood in the front row, tears lining his soot-streaked cheeks. Edric stood beside her, not as her savior or superior but as her equal. When the Flamekeeper's mantle was offered, a cloak woven with deep red threads that shimmered like coal in starlight, he placed it on her shoulders with steady hands. "Not Queen of Fire," he whispered, smiling as the weight settled. "Queen of Embers. The kind that last. The kind that build." Her title, once spoken only in lost myths and half-remembered bedtime tales, returned to life in full voice. Flamekeeper, Not a ruler of people through power, but of truth through flame. The court did not understand it at first, what it meant to have a queen who held silence like a weapon sharper than any blade. Who answered cruelty not with punishment but with clarity. Who walked barefoot through the palace not because she lacked shoes, but because the stone warmed beneath her presence. Within weeks, the customs of court began to shift. Nobles were expected to answer questions, not evade them. The palace opened its eastern wing to those who had once been forgotten. Children with no homes, outcasts whispered about for their strange gifts, refugees from border towns. They came trembling. They stayed laughing. The palace hearth never dimmed. Each night, Marin sat beside it and listened. Sometimes she told stories. Sometimes she listened to those who had none and offered silence in return, the kind that healed. Silly and the stepmother were exiled. Not imprisoned. Not executed. Marin had refused such measures. No more fear, she said when the council asked. Let them live with truth instead. A small, simple house was offered to them on the edge of the kingdom. They took it. Silly, stripped of her silks, faded into quiet. The stepmother, who had once barked orders in opulent halls, now washed her own dishes in silence. One afternoon, months after the coronation, Marin visited them. She did not send notice. She walked alone, cloaked in a deep rust-colored wrap, carrying no guards or heralds. When Silly opened the door and saw her standing there, no crown, no entourage, just her, she dropped the bowl she was holding. It shattered on the floor. Marin said nothing. Silly stood frozen, guilt rising like smoke. Her lips parted, perhaps to plead, perhaps to scream. But Marin raised one hand. Not to silence her, just to still the moment. I did not come for vengeance, Marin said. Only to look you in the eyes. Silly's voice was small. Why? Marin didn't answer. She stepped forward into the modest house, looked once at the cold hearth behind them, unlit and used, and then turned back to leave. On the doorstep, she paused and spoke over her shoulder, her voice quiet but firm. Fire does not always destroy. Sometimes it reveals. Then she walked away. That night, back at the palace, she sat beside her own fire with Edric. The children gathered around, not noble-born but flame-chosen in their own right. One clutched a flute carved from cherry wood. Another braided strips of silk for the new wall tapestries. A third leaned against Marin's leg, sleepy but content. She looked into the fire and saw not pain but beginning. The embers glowed steadily. Not just warmth. Legacy.